Good evening. I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also check out our website at weather.gov/Alaska. Get updates through that means as well. A quick reminder, as we approach breakup and river watch season, we do want your help. If you have any pictures of any changes to the river ice, please let us know, or if there happens to be any flooding, alert us as well. You can submit reports to the email over on the right, nws.ar.aprfc@noaa.gov, or call 1-800-847-1739. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we can see a low pressure system that was south of the central Aleutian Islands that is pushed farther to the east towards the eastern Aleutian Islands. And as we watch this again, you can see the frontal system moving through the southern portions of the Bering Sea, extending out over the Alaska Peninsula, spreading cloud cover out over Kodiak Island and the Bristol Bay area. Out over mainland Alaska, however, fairly clear skies until we get up along the Arctic coast, where we do have some areas of fog up there. And then finally down in the Panhandle area, fairly clear there as well, as we do see the front not quite there yet, still out over the Gulf of Alaska by the end of this loop. Taking a look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we have high pressure out over to the northeast of mainland Alaska, with our low pressure system south of the eastern Aleutian Islands, and this pattern is going to result in most of the active weather being southern portions of the state, to include the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Out over the Bering and Aleutians, we have a mixture of rain and snow, more snow up to the north in areas like the Pribilof Islands, and more rain from many of the Aleutian Islands, Alaska Peninsula. Then out ahead of the front, we're seeing some of that rain making it into Kodiak Island, with some snow up in the mountains, and then some rain for areas around Prince William Sound and the eastern Kenai Peninsula. Once again, snow at some of those higher elevations. Much of the rest of mainland Alaska will be fairly dry, but we will have areas of fog underneath the high pressure along the Arctic coast and down by St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait. Down in the Panhandle, fairly clear skies for the rest of today. Moving into tonight, we're going to have some cloud cover moving in over the Panhandle, but no precipitation for tonight. That front will have stretched out into some of the southern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing rain to much of the western Gulf and then into Prince William Sound, eastern Kodiak Peninsula. Kodiak Island will also see some rain, and then southwest Alaska, a mix of rain and snow as well. Rain and snow throughout the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutian Islands. Mainland Alaska primarily fairly dry, but we will see continued fog along the Arctic coastline as we have ridging coming in from the east over the area, and then we'll see some fog out by St. Lawrence Island and through the Bering Strait. As we move into Friday, we will finally have the rain from that frontal system moving into the Panhandle area with that southerly push of the warm air from the south. And then we do have our frontal system moving well into the Gulf at this point, with our low now south of the Alaska Peninsula. This is going to bring rain and snow throughout all of the Gulf coastline, with some snow at some of the mountains in the higher elevations. And the rest of South Central will be fairly dry on the western side of the Chugach Mountains, as well as in the Copper River Basin and Matanuska and Susitna Valleys. Then for the Bristol Bay area, we'll see a mixture of rain and snow, primarily rain at the lower elevations, and then rain and snow for the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians. Up along the Arctic coastline, continued fog up along the coast, and then fog by St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait once again here on Friday. However, we do have some ridging pushing in out by the western Aleutian Islands from the west. That's starting to clear out some of the precipitation out there. But as we move into Saturday, a new frontal system will come in over the western Aleutians, bringing rain back to the area. However, that ridging will have moved over to the east, clearing out some areas around the central Aleutian Islands, but some lingering showers out for the Alaska Peninsula, especially on the Bering side. Our former system will now have moved south of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing rain throughout the Gulf region into the Panhandle, as well as all along the Gulf Coast, with some snow at some of the higher elevations. Much of mainland Alaska continues to be fairly dry on Saturday, including the west coast, interior, and finally up along the Arctic coastline. However, we do have some of that ridging still nosing in over the Arctic coast. As we look at our temperature forecast for Friday morning out over the Panhandle area, down into the lower to mid 30s. Lower to mid 30s also for much of the south central area, in the 20s for some of the more interior locations like Talkeetna and the Copper River Basin. Friday afternoon in the Panhandle, we are going to get up into the 50s. Yakutat will stay a little cooler at 48, but into the 40s, mid to upper 40s for much of the south central area Friday afternoon. For Saturday morning, dropping back down into the 30s for most locations in the Panhandle. Some locations still staying near 40, like Sitka and Yakutat, not Yakutat, up by Haines and Skagway. And then for south central Alaska, dropping down into the mid to upper 30s, with the Copper River Basin getting down to the mid 20s. Saturday afternoon highs getting up to near 50 degrees for much of the Panhandle area. Mid to upper 40s for many locations in south central, with the Anchorage area through Talkeetna getting up around 50 degrees. As we move up to the northern portions of the state, starting off in the interior, temperatures dropping down into the 20s for central interior on Friday morning, in the teens as we get farther to the east, and then only in the 30s as we get farther to the west. Up along the Arctic coastline, near zero for those Friday morning lows, Kotzebue Sound area in the teens, and in the upper 20s for Norton Sound. Friday afternoon highs getting up to near 50 degrees for southern locations of the interior, and then in 40s for other locations. Up along the Arctic coastline, getting up into the teens, to near 30 degrees for the Kotzebue Sound, and the lower 40s for the Norton Sound. Saturday morning lows dropping down to near 30 degrees for most locations, a little bit warmer as we get farther to the east, 35 for Galena. Up along the Arctic coastline, staying just above zero. Then in the Norton Sound area, getting to around 20 degrees and around 30 degrees for the Norton Sound. Saturday afternoon highs getting up into the 50s for the interior, then up into the teens for much of the Arctic coast, some locations getting up to near 20. And then the Kotzebue Sound area near 30, getting a little bit warmer at Kotzebue, 35 degrees there, and near 40 for the Norton Sound. Southwest Alaska on Friday morning dropping down into the 30s. That's going to be true for the Aleutian Islands as well. Friday afternoon highs getting up to near 50 degrees for more interior locations, in the 40s along the coast, and near 40 for the Aleutian Islands. Saturday morning lows dropping down to the mid-30s for southwest Alaska, and mid-30s are going to continue through the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Islands, mid-20s for the Pribilofs. Saturday afternoon highs getting up into the 50s for interior locations, into the 40s near the coast, and around 40 for the Aleutian Islands, mid-30s for the Pribilof Islands. For our 6 to 10 day climate outlook, we are expecting higher chances to be above normal as we get down to southwest Alaska, and diminishing as we get into much of the rest of mainland Alaska, but still higher chances to be above normal for all of the mainland.
Hi, my name is Selena Van Breukelen. I'm a hydrologist at the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center, and today I'm going to be bringing you your 2022 breakup briefing for April 21st. There are 3 components that we consider when we look at the potential for breakup and ice jam flooding. The first is the ice thickness and the strength. The second is the snowpack, because that is the available water in the watershed, which is potentially available to cause flooding. And the third thing that we look at are the spring weather patterns, particularly the late April and early May temperature patterns, as they control the snowmelt rates as well as the thermal condition and integrity of the ice. Now, these 2 factors, the melting snow and the degrading ice, depending on how those 2 forces balance, is critical as to whether or not we're going to have ice jams and ice jam related flooding. So if the snow melts very quickly and we have a big push of water on intact strong ice, that's going to increase our potential for ice jams and ice jam flooding. If, on the other hand, is we have a slow warm up, then we're going to slowly melt the low elevation snow as well as degrade the ice that's in the channel. So with this setup, we're going to have a relatively weak ice by the time that we get that snow melt push, and have less likelihood of ice jams and ice jam related flooding. This year, looking at that statewide snowpack, the key point is that we have a lot of snow which has fallen this winter. Particularly the Yukon watershed, including the Fairbanks, including the main stem Yukon River, as well as the Canadian Yukon draining in from the east. I think what makes this year different is that we have so many watersheds that have well above normal snowpack. It's very common for in any year for there to be a handful of sites which have a robust snowpack, but to have the entire state be shades of blue, it is something that we haven't seen in many years. The snowpack is generally 150 to 200% of normal, meaning that we have almost double the amount of snow that we have had over the past records that we've kept over the past 30 years. So roughly double the snowmelt of a normal year. On the North Slope, we don't have very much data, but for what we do have, it looks like that snowpack is close to average. This is the map of the village flood potential. So this is created by initially starting with how flood prone each of these communities are, based on how closely they are built to the river and their history of flooding. And the second thing we look at is, are there any of those three components, be it snow or ice thickness, two components, snow or ice thickness, that's going to create an above average potential for these communities to experience flooding. So the one community that we're highlighting as having a high flood potential is on the upper Yukon, is the community of Circle. And that is because there are many sites in the Canadian Yukon which are reporting record snowpack, and Circle does have a history of flooding. The second category, which is the moderate high, which is our second highest category for flood potential, they're going to be on the Yukon, the communities of Amonik and Alukkanuk. And that is because those communities are built relatively close to the river, and the Yukon watershed, like we've been saying, has quite a robust snowpack this year. Then the other four communities that are in the moderate high ranking are on the Kuskokwim River. Those are the communities of Sleetmute and Red Devil on the upper Kuskokwim, and then Aniak and Kwethluk on the middle and lower Kuskokwim. And then the communities which have a moderate flood potential this year are Crooked Creek and the community of Upper and Lower Kalskag. This graphic is showing our potential for our snowmelt runoff and our related snowmelt flooding. The snowmelt runoff typically happens a few weeks after that initial ice jam and that initial breakup push. And we've highlighted much of central and the interior and south central Alaska as having above average chances for snowmelt flooding, just based on the very robust snowpack that we have throughout the state. As far as breakup timing, we are expecting breakup to be a few days later than normal statewide. This is because we have had colder than normal temperatures throughout the month of April. So for the vast majority of interior Alaska, we're expecting the breakup dates to be 2 to 5 days later than normal. For Southwest Alaska and the YK Delta, we're expecting breakup to be 1 to 3 days later. And then for the North Slope, we're expecting breakup to be about average. Here's a quick look at some of the webcams that we have around the state. In the tributaries of the Yukon, we have the Nenana Ice Classic. We can see that on the Tanana River at Nenana, that there is still snow, which is on the ice, which still has to melt before we're going to get breakup. One thing I'd like to mention is the snow on the opposite hillside. Normally by this time in the year, much of that snow has gone. The fact that there still is snow there is going to be a combination for how much snow fell throughout the winter, and also the fact that our temperatures have been colder than normal. The second webcam shot is from the Chena River, and that's viewed from the Pro Music store in downtown Fairbanks. We can see that that ice still looks very much like winter ice, and there's still some snow in the Fairbanks area. Looking on the main stem Yukon, these are from our friends, the Fresh Eyes on Ice group, part of UAF. They have a webcam at Galena and at Eagle, and we can still see that there are wintertime conditions in both of these locations. Eagle in particular has been setting record low temperatures over the past few days, so it's still very much wintertime on the upper Yukon. Moving further to the southwest, looking at the Kuskokwim River watershed, the upper Kuskokwim River, which we can see from our Fresh Eyes on Ice camera at Sleetmute, we can still see that that has wintertime conditions. There's still a bit of low elevation snow, and the river ice is still very much intact. And then we can compare this to the figure on the right, which is from the Bethel Ice Classic camera, which we can see that the ice is further along towards spring, and we really don't have any more low elevation snow to melt. Just wrapping up our breakup outlook, due to our snowpack, we think that the probability of snowmelt flooding is above average for the entire state of Alaska, with the exception of the North Slope rivers, and also above average for as far as a probability of ice jam flooding for the majority of the state, excluding the North Slope rivers. This is because we are still colder than normal, and we're concerned about having a quick warm-up and ice jams related to that quick surge of snowmelt. So keep up to date on our website. These are the URLs for the Alaska Breakup Map, the Graphical Breakup Outlook, as well as our URLs. And feel free to send us observations for what's happening in the river in your neck of the woods. Thank you very much.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Friday morning. Due to the system south of the Alaska Peninsula, we are seeing MVFR conditions through much of the southern Bering, Aleutian Islands extending out through much of the Gulf of Alaska as well, with some isolated areas of IFR through the eastern portions of the Bering as well as the eastern Aleutians, and some isolated areas by Kodiak and the Alaska Range as well. Some of those MVFR conditions are extending all the way to the southern portions of the Panhandle, but most of the Panhandle will still be VFR on Friday morning. Throughout much of the state, we are going to see VFR conditions. However, as we get further up to the north, we will see some areas of IFR, especially along the north slope. Moving into Friday afternoon, we are expecting of northern portions of the mainland Alaska through the interior to clear up and be VFR. However, with the system in the south progressing farther to the east, we are expecting IFR conditions throughout much of the eastern Bering Sea, eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, and much of the Gulf of Alaska and some of the areas around the Gulf waters. MVFR conditions will extend in along the North Gulf Coast as well as much of the Panhandle and southwest Alaska. Then finally, by the western Aleutians, a new system coming up from the west will bring in some MVFR conditions. As we step into Saturday morning, IFR conditions are expected out over western Aleutians, as well as out by the eastern Bering Sea, up through the Seward Peninsula area, and down south through the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. With our system moving further into the Gulf waters, we are seeing IFR conditions throughout much of the Gulf and North Gulf Coast, including Kodiak Island. MVFR conditions for much of the rest of coastal areas around south central Alaska, as well as all of the Panhandle, are expected. Central and eastern areas of the interior should be VFR as well as along the North Slope areas. Then finally, Saturday afternoon, we are going to see some isolated areas of IFR moving into the North Slope area, but much of the mainland should be VFR until we get way out by the west coast, where some IFR conditions will be out over the water, as well as some MVFR conditions down along the North Gulf Coast and into the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. In the Gulf waters, we are expecting some IFR conditions and MVFR primarily for the Panhandle. Our other system is bringing in more IFR conditions to the western Aleutians, with MVFR extending into the the central Aleutians. For our passes on Friday, AKwx should be VFR throughout the day as well as at Adigan. However, Lake Clark and Merrill will be down in IFR conditions but improve to MVFR in the afternoon. Rainy will be starting off MVFR and then improving all the way to VFR in the afternoon, whereas windy will be VFR throughout the day as well as at Isabel and at Mintasta. Tanita should also be VFR conditions throughout Friday, and then Portage will start off MVFR and drop down to IFR conditions in the afternoon. Chilkoot and White will both start off VFR and then drop down to marginal later in the day. For our freezing levels, surface freezing line up through the northern part of the Bering Sea, up to much of the interior, then dropping down into south central Alaska, but staying north of the Panhandle. Area of 2,000 foot freezing levels out over the western portions of the interior, and then we are getting up to as high as 4,000 feet for the southern portions of the Panhandle. For our icing with our system approaching the Gulf waters, we are seeing icing through much of the southern portion of the mainland, out through Gulf waters and the Panhandle. Above 3,000 feet is expected for the Panhandle, above 2,000 for South Central, above 3,000 for the YK Delta, and above 2,000 for the Alaska Peninsula and Eastern Aleutian Islands. For the jet stream, we are seeing strongest portion of the jet out over the Central Aleutian Islands out of a northwesterly direction up to as high as 90 knots. Then a small jet streak out around 70 knots out of a southeasterly direction over south central Alaska. Down to 9,000 feet. Strongest winds are actually going to be over the Kenai Mountains up to as high as 55 knots out of a southeasterly direction. Dropping down to 40 knots as we get closer towards the Bethel area and the YK Delta. Down in the Panhandle area, southerly winds are going to be up to as high as 40 knots moving into the inside waters. And then out over the Aleutian Islands, primarily northerly flow, around 35 knots for the eastern Aleutian Islands, getting closer to 50 knots for the central and western. Down to 3,000 feet, clearing up quite a bit for the western Aleutian Islands. Strongest winds over the Aleutians will be out by the central and eastern Aleutian Islands, 35 knots up by the Pribilof Islands, getting up to 40 knots just south of the Aleutians. Then out over southwest Alaska, we are going to see winds around 25 knots out over the YK Delta, but picking up to 40 knots as we move over the Bristol Bay area, with 45 knots around Iliamna area and Lake Iliamna itself. Then out over the northern Gulf waters, we are going to see some of our strongest winds for Friday at 3,000 feet, up to as high as 55 knots out of a southeasterly direction, pushing into Prince William Sound, but dropping down as we get closer to Cook Inlet, only around 40 knots there. Then down in the Panhandle, up to as high as 30 knots out of the south. For our turbulence all along the North Gulf Coast, below 4,000 feet by the Panhandle, below 6,000 feet for South Central, and then Southwest Alaska by Bristol Bay, below 5,000 feet, and below 3,000 feet for the Central Aleutians.
A fun conjunction is nearly upon us, stargazers. Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Venus, and the Moon will all dance around each other in the morning sky. You'll want a good spot so you can come back day after day. You ready? First, hit the skies starting on April 24th around 6 a.m. facing southeast to find a conjunction of the Moon and Saturn. Then, on the 25th, the Moon will encounter Mars. Spectacular. Then, on the 26th, the Moon meets up with Venus. Hey, what you been up to? Oh, not much, just hanging. Then, on the 27th, Jupiter joins the planet party in a Jupe-Moon conjunction. And you'll probably get some good Earth shine on those last 2 nights, too. Finally, we'll have a Venus-Jupiter conjunction on the 30th. They will be so close and so bright. Whew, what a planet party. As they're all preceding the sun, don't be too fashionably late for this planet party. Thanks for watching. Keep looking up.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at our ice edge. We do expect retreating ice between St. Matthew Island and St. Lawrence Island as we have multiple systems coming up through the Bering over the next week. And then we're going to see continued melting of the shore-fast ice that is from the Kuskokwim Delta through the Yukon Delta. Down in southeast Alaska, we're looking at the inside waters, southerly to southeasterly winds, 15 to 25 knots, weaker up in Lynn Canal and then stronger as we get farther to the south. In the eastern Gulf, southeast winds 30 knots, picking up to 35 to 40 knots as we get into the northern Gulf, with seas up to as high as 15 feet in the northern Gulf. On Saturday in the inside waters, northerly winds 10 to 20 knots, becoming southeasterly in the southern locations up to as high as 25 knots. Out over the Gulf waters, south to southeast winds 25 knots in the eastern Gulf, and then 30 knots as we get farther to the north. For South Central Alaska, primarily easterly flow at all locations, 35 to 40 knots out over the Gulf and on the western side of the Barren Islands, 30 to 35 in the Cook Inlet area, and 30 knots in Prince William Sound. Then on Saturday, starting to get a little bit more northerly components, so east to northeast winds in most locations out over the Gulf, 30 knots, 25 knots in Prince William Sound, 20 to 25 knots in Cook Inlet, and 30 knots west of the Barren Islands. Out over the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, east to northeast winds in most locations, 15 to 25 knots on the Bering side of the peninsula, 20 knots on the Pacific side, and then 25 to 30 knots around Kodiak Island. Seas up to as high as 17 feet on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula. On Saturday, winds switching up quite a bit, going to be west to northwest around the peninsula, 15 to 20 knots on the Bering side, 20 knots on the Pacific side, and 25 knots out of a northeasterly direction around Kodiak Island. For the Aleutian Islands on Friday, we're seeing northerly winds out by the eastern Aleutians, 15 to 25 knots, becoming 30 knots out of northwesterly direction for the central Aleutians, and then 15 to 25 knots as we move by the western Aleutians, weaker as we get farther to the west. Seas up to as high as 16 feet, highest on the Pacific side of the eastern Aleutians. Then on Saturday, out over the eastern Aleutians, westerly winds 25 to 30 knots, dropping down to 20 to 25 for the central Aleutians, and then becoming southerly 30 knots for the western Aleutian Islands. Along the west coast of the state, primarily a north to northeast wind component at all locations, 15 knots up north, 20 knots by Nunavik Island, picking up to 25 knots south of Nunavik Island and by the Pribilof Islands, seas up to as high as 11 feet by the Pribilof Islands. On Saturday, still seeing northerly winds by St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound around 10 knots, 20 knots out of northwesterly direction by Nunavik Island, 15 knots out of the west by St. Matthew Island, and 20 knots out of a northwesterly direction by the Pribilof Islands. Up along the Arctic coastline, east to southeast winds 15 to 25 knots, Beaufort Sea seeing the strongest winds. Variable winds down the west coast until we get by the Bering Strait, we'll see northeast winds at 15 knots. Then on Saturday, weak westerly flow along the Arctic coastline, only around 5 knots. Northerly winds down the west coast, around 10 knots there. For a recap for tonight's weather, we have a low pressure system that's tracking easterly on the southern side of the Aleutian Islands. As we move into tonight, we do expect that low to be south of the Alaska Peninsula, bringing up quite a bit of rain with this system for southern locations. So we are seeing rain throughout the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula. Some of the higher elevations could see some snow, and then rain throughout the western portions of the Gulf of Alaska ahead of this frontal system, making it into the Prince William Sound area, eastern portions of the Kenai Peninsula, as well as Kodiak Island and the Alaska Range. Again, some of the higher elevations could see a mixture with snow. High pressure up north that's extending in over the Arctic coastline is keeping much of mainland Alaska dry for the tonight period, but we will have fog along the Arctic coastline as well as down through the Bering Strait at St. Lawrence Island. We're also going to see drier conditions out by the Panhandle before that front can make it in. But as we move into Friday, especially later in the day on Friday, as the front pushes through the Gulf of Alaska, we are going to see rain reaching the Panhandle area, extending throughout the Panhandle with some of the higher elevations up north, with the potential to see some snow mix in. Then we are going to have widespread rain throughout the Gulf and locations around the Gulf, to include Prince William Sound, areas of the Kenai Peninsula and Kodiak Island. And then we will have some rain from that front also making it into the Bristol Bay area, with higher elevations still seeing some snow. A mixture of rain and snow out over the eastern portion of the Bering Sea and extending down into the eastern Aleutians as well as the Alaska Peninsula. Up north, high pressure is still allowing for fog to develop along the Arctic coastline, and then we're also going to see some areas of fog by St. Lawrence Island. On Saturday, our low pressure will be near the Gulf waters, bringing rain throughout the Gulf and regions around the Gulf, including the Panhandle, North Gulf Coast, and Kodiak Island. A new system will be moving in from the west, bringing rain to the western Aleutians. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal, pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.